Okay, so we're ready to move on for the second half of the morning. Thank you very much for coming back reasonably promptly. So this next session is our opportunity in cross-care teen counselling to beat our own chests a little bit and to celebrate the work of 40 years and particularly the work that has gone on in the last 4 years in attempting to move it on into a very professionalised presentation of service which has been manualised and professionally researched and evaluated. And just on that basis, I've only been working with cross-care teen counselling for the past year, so I just want to take this opportunity. There's been 4 years of very hard work has gone into getting to this point in the service. The service has been running for the 40 years. People have been doing the practice and doing the research, as John and Nuala said earlier, all the time as they've gone. But this was the process of moving it into a very formalised process. And so I want to take the opportunity. You will meet Alan Carr in a moment and Mary Forrest, who led this process from the research point of view and from the clinical point of view. But I particularly want to take the opportunity to acknowledge the work of Jane Fry, of Tom Casey and of Fidelma Byrne, who as members of teen counselling staff have worked really hard in producing the manual and producing the research. And to Ciara Cassells from UCD, who undertook this work as part of her PhD submission. And then also to all of the staff in teen counselling who've worked really hard, because in terms of data collection and getting everything right and in the right order at the right time, it's been a really difficult and challenging process, and we really appreciate the work that everybody has put into it. So now is the time to actually implement, as Nuala rightly said, and to implement it faithfully and diligently, and also to pass on the good news to other people. So I'm really delighted this morning to have the opportunity to introduce Professor Alan Carr, who's going to present the first half of the story, which is the evaluation of positive systemic practice. And again, Alan needs very little introduction to people who work in this sector. They will know him very well. He's a well-published person in the sector, and his work really speaks for itself. And Alan will be followed by Mary Forrest. And Mary has been Clinical Director of Teen Counselling for probably quite some time, maybe a little bit longer than she'd care to remember. But Mary has been really pushing forward this service in this direction for quite some time. And it's a testament to the work that Mary and her team have done that we're at this stage now. So I'll introduce Alan and then it'll be followed by Mary. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Aidan. It's great to be here after 4 years. Could I just say that teen counselling is an organisation very close to my heart. My first job was in Jervis Street Drug Advisory Centre, which was the only drug treatment centre in Ireland back in the 1970s. And our service consulted to what was teen counselling's forerunner, Mater Dei Counselling Centre up on the Clonliffe Road. And I think it was back in the mid-1970s. I can't see Fiona, but Fiona, will you stand up from... Fiona, here you are. Would you just stand up and say hello to people? Because you're the founder of Mater Dei and Teen Counselling. And when we were doing this project, we went back to Fiona and to Kathleen Kelleher and talked to them about their ideas about how the service developed, and they've been the inspiration for all of this work, and it's really lovely that you're here today. Let's talk about the story of how the project came to be. This is the story of positive systemic practice. Back in May 2008, myself and my colleagues in UCD held a conference on adolescent substance use. And this is the poster for the conference up on the board here. And we had the great and the good. All the top guys from America came over and spoke at this. And we presented some of our research in the epidemiology of substance use among adolescents in Ireland at the conference. And at that conference, one of the keynote speakers was this guy, Howard Little. And Howard Little would be recognised by some of you as one of the leading exponents around the world, international leading exponents of the use of family therapy to treat adolescent substance use. And what Howard Little has done is he's taken pretty much all that we know about family therapy and integrated it into this wonderful, multi-dimensional family therapy model. And he's developed that and manualized it and written it out as a series of steps that practitioners can use. And then he's evaluated in a very large series of randomized controlled trial, and it would now be recognized as one of the top approaches in the world for treating adolescent substance use, one of the top evidence-based approaches. Now, just say, it's a complex approach to practice, but one of the key elements of it is when Howard works with families, he meets with the teenager and the parents and the siblings initially, and he does 1 or 2 family meetings. But then after those, if you want, assessment meetings and alliance building meetings, he then splits the family into the teenager and the parents, and a separate counsellor is assigned to the teenager and another one to the parents, and they engage in parallel series of counselling sessions, and periodically then, when the time seems to be right and when the level of conflict has reduced somewhat between the adolescent and the parents, periodic family meetings are convened. And Howard was talking about how this was a tremendously useful approach to working with adolescents, and then he showed us all his data on how it worked and how effective it was, and so forth. Now, at that 2008 conference in UCD, I met Mary Forrest. Now, I know Mary well, but I met her, just happened to run into her at the conference, and she said, there's a huge similarity between what Howard Little is doing over there in Miami, this really fancy evidence-based approach to family therapy, and what we've been doing here in teen counselling, and what Fiona and Kathleen have been doing in Mater Dei for the last 40 years. Both of them seem to involve initial family meetings and then series of parallel sessions for the parents. Whose phone is that? It's not mine, is it? It's yours. Got mine under here. I hope I've turned it off. But Mary said to me, there seem to be huge similarities between what Howard Little is doing in his evidence-based multidimensional family therapy and what we've been doing here in teen counselling. They both involve family sessions, then these parallel adolescent and parent sessions, and then periodic family sessions after that, and linking with other agencies. And they're both based on kind of a systemic conceptualization of the adolescent in the family, in the school, in the peer group, in the community. And they both look at adolescents as individuals at a stage of life cycle development within a family life cycle and so forth. So, teen counselling, Mary said, wanted to establish their service as an evidence-based service. And you remember back in 2008, the finances of the world went wallop. Do you remember that? And I remember thinking our conference is going to go wallop, and we reduced the admission rate and everything for our conference. And we didn't get this many people, but we got some people in. But there really was pressure on all services to show that they were evidence-based and effective. And Mary had this great idea. She said, what about if we import multidimensional family therapy into the whole of teen counselling and become an accredited multidimensional family therapy centre, and then that will show that we're evidence-based, and then we'll be more likely to sustain our funding during these tough economic times. So Mary and myself and a number of colleagues, including Jane and Fidelma and colleagues from the Clanwilliam Institute and colleagues from Queen's University in Northern Ireland who had a link with Howard Little, we met and we had a number of exploratory meetings about the feasibility of introducing multidimensional family therapy into teen counselling, and we came to 2 conclusions. Number 1, up here on the board, the first one, it was much too expensive. It was going to cost us an arm and a leg to introduce this thing into Ireland. And the second thing was that the treatment manuals and the videos and so on were culturally, well, they weren't quite appropriate. They would need to be tweaked quite a bit to fit into an Irish context. And so when John Charry was talking this morning about using internationally developed North American parenting programs, and then the parents that he was training saying to him, could we not make one that kind of fits Ireland? Well, that was our experience. When the UCD and the teen counselling team came together and looked at the American multidimensional family therapy, we thought, yeah, we should probably do an Irish one. So the diagram over here on the right means we found out it wasn't possible to introduce American multidimensional family therapy into Ireland. It wasn't the same thing. So our exploration consolidated, these exploratory meetings consolidated the link between the teen counselling group and our team of researchers in UCD. And we decided to establish the cross-care teen counselling approach as an evidence-based model for clinical practice, and to show that it was effective. And we had three very specific aims which are listed here. We decided that we would write an intervention manual. Now, that involved a lot of work, particularly by Jane Fry and Tom Casey, who sat down with colleagues on the teen counselling staff, counsellors from the staff, and talked with them about their cases and distilled those into a set of principles of practice or stances, and also fleshed out some very large, detailed case studies. So on the basis of those conversations, we edited that into the manual, which is available here today. We also conducted an audit. By that I mean, teen counselling had been collecting data in its 6 centres for years. And we went back and we took 3 years of data and we analysed those data that were available, taking this practice-based evidence and looking at what it said about the effectiveness of the service. We also set up a controlled trial, and over the last 3 years, we've run a controlled trial. And there's the manual that we produced. So we achieved that particular aim. Our audit is about to be published sometime in the next month or two in the journal Human Systems, the Journal of Therapy, Consultation and Training. And the controlled trial is just about to be published in the Journal of Family Therapy. So we did achieve the aims that we set out to do. We developed an evidence-based, manualised approach to therapy, and we published the results of that, and we're holding this conference today. A central and a key figure in all of this has been my PhD student, Dr. Kira Cassels, who wrote her PhD on the basis of this work, and who has since presented it around the world. So the teen counselling positive systemic practice model has been presented at conferences in North America, in the UK, in Europe, and here in Ireland. The story of positive systemic practice is unusual in that it is one of the few stories around at the moment of successful collaboration between a practice research network out in the community, that is 16 counselling services, 16 counselling centres, and a university department, that is the School of Psychology and UCD. And I think this is the model going forward for doing research on approaches to treatment that work with young people and with adults across the lifespan. So I think that what we have to have in the future is collaborations between practice research networks out in the community and research departments inside universities. This is complex work and it involves commitment from an awful lot of people. And I just hope I haven't left some people out of this list. These are all of the people who were involved in the execution of this particular project. And of course, there were the founders of the service as well. There was Fianna Finn and Kathleen Kelleher, who spoke to us at the beginning. But during the execution of the project, these are all the people, 25 people were involved, and they included a research team from teen counselling, a research team from UCD, a group of very committed and highly skilled counsellors, and a group of very skilled and highly committed administrators. These are the secretaries on the front desks of the various centres who knew how the project was working. We trained them in how the project was working, and they helped us recruit people into the project and helped us with data collection. Okay. Projects like this can't be run without funding. And we didn't have huge funding, but we're very appreciative of the funding we did get. And here we've listed some of the sources of funding. So we had National Lottery funding, and we had the Teen Counselling Research Fund, and the service is also funded by these agencies listed above. Okay. So that's a bit of the story. But to make sense of the story of positive systemic practice, and particularly to make sense of the conclusion that we reached, it will be a good thing to put it in an international context. So let me start off by saying we know from international epidemiology that 1 in 5 adolescents around the world and in Ireland suffers from significant emotional and behavioural problems. And when the Minister was standing here this morning, she said she'd been at a launch of an ESRI report recently that showed that about 19% of 3-year-olds have problems. That's nearly 20%, which is 1 in 5. So this is an international finding that about 1/5 of youngsters are vulnerable. And the Handbook of Child and Adolescent Clinical Psychology is up there because if you want a review of the epidemiology, you'll find it in that text. When I say significant behavioural and emotional problems, I'm using those terms, behavioural and emotional, as kind of umbrella words for things that you would be very, very familiar with. So when I say behavioural problems, I'm talking about rule breaking, bullying, conduct disorder, delinquency, substance use. When I talk about emotional problems, I'm talking about stress, anxiety, depression, self-harm, and responses to bullying. So 1 in 5 youngsters have these kinds of problems. Now, in the current economic climate, funders are requiring services for children, young people and their families to show that they're evidence-based, that they're effective and that they're cost-effective. And certainly the presentation by Nuala and John have underlined that this morning. Now, systemic intervention for adolescent problems meet all 3 of these criteria. And when I say systemic, I mean interventions which focus on the adolescent in their family, in their peer group, in their schools, in the wider community. They're the multiple systems in which adolescents are embedded. And systemic interventions for adolescents meet the 3 criteria of being evidence-based, effective and cost-effective. When we look at the research evidence base for systemic interventions for adolescents, some simple conclusions can be drawn. First of all, about 2 out of 3 adolescents and their families show improvement with family-based interventions. It's about 66%, thereabouts. The evidence base for family intervention is reviewed in a series of books and journal articles that my team have been involved with. The green book there, What Works with Children, Adolescents and Adults, published in 2009, is probably our team's most comprehensive summary of the evidence base at the moment. I also did a report, The Effectiveness of Psychotherapy, for the Irish Council of Psychotherapy, which summarises some of the evidence base. For those of you from the family therapy field, you'll know that the last chapter of Family Therapy Concepts, Process and Practice summarises the evidence base, I think up to about 2010 or 11. And in the Journal of Family Therapy, every few years I put out 2 big reviews. They came out in 2000, 2008, and the next 2 I've just finished writing, they'll be out in 2014, and they look at the effectiveness of family therapy for child-focused and adult-focused problems. So those of you that want a quick and dirty access to our summary of the evidence base for systemic interventions, I recommend those 2 articles that will be out next year. For more detailed stuff, go to the Green Book. Okay, now systemic family-based interventions tend to be more effective than individual approaches in a number of very specific ways. Now we all know, I mean many of you I know you work individually with adolescents and you do one-to-one counselling, and that can be terribly effective for a proportion of adolescents. But work with the wider system seems to be important in certain instances, and systemic interventions tend to be more effective than individual interventions for more severe problems. They work better also for adolescents who have difficulties that have a big impact on others. So one-to-one interventions can be very good for depression and for anxiety, but when you move on to conduct disorders and eating disorders, probably better off taking a systemic approach. Systemic approaches, by and large, have much lower dropout than individual approaches. And that makes a lot of sense, because often teenagers have difficulty getting themselves motivated to be in counselling, but their parents tend to have less difficulty. Systemic interventions tend to require fewer sessions than individual therapy, and also their effects tend to be sustained over time. And that makes a lot of sense, because if you do individual therapy with a youngster and then they stop doing therapy, they may go back to a family, a peer group, and a school where nothing has changed. But if you're doing systemic therapy, there will be changes in the family, the peer group, and the wider system. And so that when the youngster is in a changed system, their changes may continue and be sustained. Now, systemic family-based interventions are more effective than individual approaches for adolescent problems for 2 main reasons. First of all, they help everyone cooperate. They help teenagers, parents, schools, and other involved agencies work together to support adolescent development. And this is really important, the idea of working together, and one of the points that was underlined by the Minister this morning, that we need greater interagency cooperation. Systemic interventions provide a frame of reference for doing that. The second reason that systemic interventions are more effective, in my opinion, is they reduce conflict between teenagers and their parents, between families and schools, and between one agency and another. And we know when we've worked with multi-agency cases that often different agencies would have a different take on the best way forward. And invariably in these families, the views of adolescents and the parents are at loggerheads. And systemic interventions provide a context and a way for addressing these kinds of conflicts. Okay. There isn't time within the 20 minutes available for me to review a huge amount of literature on what are the most effective approaches for adolescents. So I thought what I would do is just list them. And just in case you and I ever end up in one of those awful pub quizzes where they show you the pictures of people and then ask you to match the pictures with the names, just thought I'd show you the pictures of some of the guys. So the next time we're at a pub quiz, will you remember this? Because my memory's shot. The top guy, the baldy guy, that's Howard Little, and he invented multidimensional family therapy. The next guy, the guy there in the shirt and tie, that's Scott Hengler. He invented multi-systemic therapy, which is a particularly effective approach for delinquency, been evaluated around the world. The next two guys, Jim Alexander and Tom Sexton, are the founders and developers of functional family therapy. And those of you from the Clondalkin area may know Tom Sexton because he's involved there in the functional family therapy Families First project. And this guy down the bottom, Jose Zapoznik, is the developer of brief strategic family therapy. Now these are multidimensional family therapy, multisystemic therapy, functional family therapy, and brief strategic family therapy are the approaches that have been found to be very effective for behaviour problems, for delinquency, for substance use, and so forth. Looking to the emotional problems, these are the family-based interventions that have particularly well developed and have strong evidence bases. That's not to say that there aren't others. So this top guy wouldn't be too well known at the moment, but this is an up-and-coming approach, attachment-based family therapy developed by Guy Diamond. And this is a very, very good intervention for youngsters who have depression or who are self-harming. Again, Scott Hengler appears on this list because he's adapted multisystemic therapy for use with teenagers with significant psychiatric problems. And this guy down the bottom may be well known to some of you, Jim Locke. He has popularized and disseminated the Maudsley model of family therapy for eating disorders, visited Ireland on a number of occasions, and certainly a lot of us over here are great respecters of his work. So these are the kind of international leaders in the field of systemic therapy. And these evidence-based interventions for adolescent problems, and we can include in here now positive systemic practice, they share a number of key characteristics. So these models which I've listed and the one that we've developed all have these particular characteristics. They're based on a developmental and systemic theory of adolescence and adolescent problems. So they're seeing youngsters as individuals embedded in families, in schools, in peer groups, in wider communities. And they're seeing adolescents as people at a particular developmental stage in life, in families that are evolving through a particular life cycle. That conceptual model, with some detail on it, underpins all these evidence-based models. Treatment involves meetings or contact, not just with the adolescents, but with families and members of the wider network as appropriate. All of these models involve relatively brief treatment which progresses through a series of stages. When I say relatively brief, I mean under a year. These models the interventions rarely go beyond a year. Some of them last as briefly as 3 months. And the interesting thing is all of the models have a kind of a beginning, a middle, and an end stage. So in the treatment manuals for all of the models, they say, at the beginning, this is how you engage with families. The kind of issues that John Shari was talking about with colleagues from the audience this morning. The whole process of forming an alliance with the teenager, the parents, the other involved professionals, getting everybody on board and getting the thing moving. So there seems to be that kind of a stage in all of the models. In the middle of the therapy, there seems to be some kind of, all of the models have some specific sets of techniques for helping people engage in collaborative problem solving. So the families are the experts on their family life and who's in the family. The treatment team are an expert on how to help people change and solve problems. They come together, they form an expert team, and during the middle phase of therapy, they do some very important social problem solving. And all of these approaches, these effective systemic approaches, involve a disengagement or a closing phase during which families are encouraged to become relatively independent in the use of these social problem-solving skills. So there's, in all of the models, there's some kind of relapse prevention process going on where people think about what will we do if in a risky situation in future if this thing happened again. Also, all of these effective interventions, this effective evidence-based systemic interventions, involve teams, and teams getting supervision from a supervisor, members of teams delivering the service to the families, and they're all working off the same hymn sheet. They all use the same manual, and they all agree that this is the way to go. This is actually quite different than multidisciplinary teamwork. Because in multidisciplinary teamwork, psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker, occupational therapist, childcare worker, all those people come in with completely different frames of reference, and they're supposed to do some kind of joint work. Which, I mean, it's not surprising that multidisciplinary teams are so dysfunctional. Because we just don't, we're never working off this. I've worked on dozens of them. Never, anytime, the functional ones I worked on, what we've tended to do is to shelve that stuff and say, let's work off the same hymn sheet for a while. When that's happened, things tend to work. When we do it the other way, all the disciplines coming together with their different expertise and so on, generally what you get is chaos. So that's private opinion there. It's based on 40 years of experience. It's not just me, is it? And by the way, I'm looking out here and I'm looking at some psychiatrists saying, yeah, geez, I wish someone had said that before. Okay. So the next question that I was asked to answer is, does positive systemic practice work? And I'll talk to you very, very briefly, because my time's running out here, about the retrospective audit and the prospective controlled trial. Now, in the retrospective audit, we took all the cases that attended teen counselling, cross-care teen counselling between 2007 and 2009. There were 754 new cases were referred to the 5 cross-care teen counselling services that were operating at that time. There's now a 6th teen counselling centre, which wasn't operating during those years. Now, at intake and at closing, ratings were made by 89 adolescents, 91 parents, and 188 counsellor ratings were made. That doesn't mean there are 188 counsellors, but counsellors made ratings on 188 families. So out of the 754 cases, we got ratings on this self-selected group of cases. And I do point out, for those of you that are avid researchers, and there's only a few of us in the audience, that this is a very self-selected group. And the adolescents were 11 to 19. There were about equal numbers of boys and girls, and the families were split 3 ways. And you'll recognise this down the bottom. Those of you that work with families and agencies know that these are the 3 kinds of families we typically see. We see about 1/3 of them are intact families with 2 parents still living together. We see a bunch of families, about 1/4 to 1/3 are single-parent families. And then we see these blended families, about 1/3 of them where there's a parent with a new partner. What I've put up on this slide here are ratings made at intake over here and at closing. So the ratings made at intake are over on that side, and the ratings made at closing are over on this side. And these ratings were made on 5-point scales from 0 to 5, about where 5 means the problem is extremely severe and 0 means that the problem isn't severe at all. And the red line is the parents' rating, and the blue line is the teenagers' rating. And what you'll notice is from intake to closing, for both the parents and the teenagers, they said the intensity of our problem or the severity of our problem reduced. So that was very straightforward. So it looks like there's something really positive going on here. And for those of you that are interested in statistics, these reductions are statistically significant. The other thing, the other set of ratings that we took from the file were made by counsellors. And at cross-care teen counselling, routinely, all counsellors make a rating at the beginning and at the end of therapy on 2 one-point rating scales. These are rating scales where there's only one item. And the item is a kind of a 100-point line. And you rate, and there are descriptions at intervals of 10 units on the line. Ratings are made about how well the young person is functioning and how well the family is functioning. Now, the young person functioning scale is called the CGAS, the Child Global Assessment of Functioning Scale, and the family scale is called the GARF, the Global Assessment of Relational Functioning. And high scores mean you're functioning much better. And what you can see is when the families came in at intake over here, they were functioning a shame it's cut off the screen, isn't it? You can't see intake written on the bottom. But over here, the low scores were the intake scores. The high scores over here were when the cases were being closed. And you can see that over the course of therapy, for both the young people and for the families, the counsellors rated them as very much improved, from around about 60 up to over 70. So they made a gain of over 10 points on these rating scales. And these gains were statistically significant. So these two slides allow us to draw a couple of conclusions. First of all, positive systemic practice led to a reduction in parent and adolescent ratings of the main problems that they came for help with. So they were saying, yes, our problems are improved. Positive systemic practice also led to improvement in the counsellors' ratings of child and family adjustment. So this is important evidence to have. But there were problems with it. With no control group, we didn't know, and by control group I mean a group of people who, where we took measurements at the same times, the same space, same points in time, but who didn't get any intervention. So with no control group, we didn't know if these improvements were due to the passage of time or due to positive systemic practice. So it could be the case that these teenagers just grew out of their problems. So to test that, we decided to go on and do a controlled trial. Now, with the controlled trial, we just set very stringent admission or entry inclusion requirements for the trial. Families of adolescents, they had to be aged 11 to 19. They had to have clinically significant emotional behavioural problems. And this was assessed by making sure that they scored over the cut-off point of 17 on the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire Total Difficulty Scale. Some of you are familiar with this, but it's been shown in international epidemiological research that people who get a score of 17 or greater on the 25-item Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, which, could I just have a show of hands, how many people have seen the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire? So you all know what I'm talking about. 25 of the most common problems you ever see in kids, and parents say, is it present, absent, or in between? Now, if you get a score of 17 or greater, if you're a parent and you fill one of these out, and on the difficulties, the total difficulty scale, you get a score above 17, you're almost 90% likely to get a psychiatric diagnosis if you're assessed by a psychiatrist. So scores of 17 or greater, I mean, these are not the worried well. These are kids with really significant problems. Now, there were 37 in the positive systemic practice treatment group and 35 in the waiting list control group. So these are relatively small groups of people that we were studying. 37 families got treatment, 35 families were on the waiting list control group. Cases were assessed at time 1. That was when at the start of the trial. They were assessed at time 2, 16 weeks later, or 4 months after they had 4 months of treatment. And the treatment group were also assessed at 6-month follow-up. We couldn't assess the control group at 6-month follow-up because we didn't think it'd be ethical. After they'd waited for 4 months, we put them into treatment. In each case, we got ratings made by a parent and by a teenager. So the parent, usually the mother, completed the questionnaires, and also the youngster completed the questionnaires. And the 2 questionnaires we used were the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, and we also used a measure of family adjustment, which we call the SCORE. And it's a 28-item measure in which people give a description of how they perceive the family at the moment. Okay. This is a really important slide. When I showed this slide to colleagues from Teen Counselling, they said, wow, it's really good to see this. I'll tell you exactly what it means. The red bar is the treatment group. The blue bar is the control group. The axis is showing the percentage of cases that improved, that got better, that recovered, that were well at the end of the trial. And what does well mean? Well means at the end of the trial, on the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, they scored below the clinical cutoff of 17 for the parent scale. And that's at the parent rating of their teenager having a problem. And they scored below the clinical cutoff, which is 20 for the youngsters. So the youngsters were getting a score below the clinical cutoff. Now, if cases reach both of those criteria, we said, yep, they're better. If they only met one, we said, no, they're not better. So this is a very conservative measure of improvement. And what you'll notice if you look at the percentage at the top, it's 65%. And those of you that have been following the story so far will remember 2 out of 3 cases. That's what the international studies show. 2/3 of people in international studies around the world, highly funded studies done in North America and Australia and so on, get better as a result of systemic intervention, systemic family intervention for adolescent problems. And what did we find here in Ireland? With the teen counselling model, exactly the same thing. two-thirds, 66% would be two-thirds. We found 65% of our cases got better. And we used a very stringent measure of what we mean by got better. And when we look at our control group, only 20% of our control group got better over the 4-month period, which would be, by the way, incidentally, that would be normal for about 20% in the control group to improve. So the findings of our study are absolutely consistent with those of our international colleagues. We did other analyses for those that may be interested. Now, these are not the number that got better. These are the average score of the group. Look at the red line. The red line is the treatment group. And you can see that from intake to 4 months into treatment to 6 months follow-up, the mean score, the average score of the treatment group on the total difficulty scale at the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, it went down and it continued to go down even after treatment was stopped. And with the control group, there was a slight reduction, but it was nothing to write home about. But we didn't only change, the positive systemic practice didn't only change the behaviour of the adolescent, it changed the parents' perception of the way their families were functioning. So if you look here at the red line, you see that there was a reduction in the level of family problems, and by the way, with the line going down, that also means an improvement in family functioning. So there was a reduction in family problems or an improvement in family functioning from the beginning of treatment to 4 months into treatment, and a very significant reduction again 6 months later. So whatever was going on in positive systemic practice, which Mary's going to describe in a couple of minutes, she'll describe in detail what was going on, these changes kept going even after therapy was stopped. And in the control group, there was a perception that there was no change whatsoever in families from this, when they came into the control group to 4 months later when they came out of the control group. Over the time they had no treatment. So these 3 slides from the control trial allowed us to say 2 important things. 2/3 of cases improved with positive systemic practice, and positive systemic practice led to reductions in adolescent behaviour problems and improvement in family adjustment. And from our point of view, those of us that were involved in this project, we don't want to keep this stuff to ourselves. We think that the big job now is to disseminate positive systemic practice nationally as an evidence-based model for helping youngsters with behavioural and emotional problems and helping their families. So maybe I'll leave it there and pass over to Mary.